Hello, fellow history buffs and time travelers, and welcome back to Old News, this time to the pivotal year of 1945. Let's start with the Yalta Conference held in the Crimea in February, which brought the Big Three, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Prime Ministers Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, together to plan the final defeat of Germany and the immediate post-war structure while the war in Europe was still ongoing. Key agreements centered on the partition of Germany and Berlin into 4 occupation zones. Crucially, Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan in exchange for territorial concessions in Asia and promised to hold free and unfettered elections in liberated Eastern European countries, particularly Poland, a promise he soon violated. The leaders also finalized the blueprint for the creation of the United Nations, establishing the fundamental structure of the Security Council to ensure global cooperation. But then, FDR died suddenly in April, just months into his unprecedented 4th term. He had been in declining health for some time, suffering from high blood pressure and heart disease, which were not widely publicized during his presidency. He was sitting for a portrait at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia, when he said, "I have a terrific headache," then collapsed from a massive cerebral hemorrhage. His passing thrust, Vice President Harry S. Truman, a relatively unknown political figure at the international level, into the presidency at a critical juncture. Truman inherited a nation still at war in the Pacific, even as victory in Europe was imminent, and quickly faced momentous decisions. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, was entering its final phase. In Europe, the Allies closed in on Nazi Germany from both east and west. The Soviet Red Army, having fought its way through Eastern Europe, launched a relentless offensive through Poland and into the heart of Germany. By April, Soviet troops were encircling Berlin, the shattered capital of Hitler's Third Reich, a Nazi propaganda term coined in 1923 as the successor to the First, Holy Roman, and Second Imperial German empires. Meanwhile, American, British, and French forces liberated Western Europe, freeing cities like Paris, Brussels, and Amsterdam. As Allied troops advanced, they uncovered the full horror of the Holocaust. Concentration camps such as Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau were liberated, exposing the systematic genocide that claimed over 6 million Jewish lives, along with millions of others, including Gypsies, Slavs, homosexuals, and others labeled by the Reich as undesirable. Survivors emerged emaciated and traumatized, and the world was confronted with the scale of Nazi atrocities. In Berlin, the end came swiftly, but not without chaos. By late April, Soviet forces had surrounded the city, pounding it with relentless artillery fire. Inside the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler faced the collapse of his empire. His health had deteriorated sharply. He was frail, trembling from Parkinson's-like symptoms, and heavily dependent on a cocktail of drugs administered by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. These included stimulants like methamphetamine, a stimulant drug called Pervitin, widely used among the German fighters, barbiturates and opiates for pain, vitamins and glucose injections to boost energy, sedatives, and even hormone treatments, leaving him physically broken and mentally unstable. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in just blocks away, Hitler took his own life by biting down on a cyanide capsule and simultaneously shooting himself in the head with a pistol. His wife, Eva Braun, whom he had married just the day before, also took cyanide. Their bodies were quickly burned in the garden above the bunker, following Hitler's orders as the Third Reich crumbled around them. Just days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally, first to the Western Allies in Reims, France on May 7th, and then to the Soviets in Berlin on May 8th. This day, the 8th, became known as VE Day, Victory in Europe, celebrated with jubilation and relief across the continent. But the scars of war remained. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead or displaced, and Europe faced the daunting task of rebuilding. Yet, the war was not over everywhere. In the Pacific, the conflict continued with brutal intensity. The United States launched massive assaults on Japanese-held islands, including the bloody battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These campaigns were marked by fierce resistance from Japanese forces, kamikaze attacks, and staggering casualties on both sides. The fighting foreshadowed the potential cost of a full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland. Faced with the prospect of even greater loss of life, President Truman, in the top seat for only a few months, made the fateful decision to use atomic weapons. The genesis of this weapon was, ironically, in Europe. In late 1938, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, working in Berlin, successfully split the uranium atom, a process they named nuclear fission. However, the theoretical interpretation of this groundbreaking work was done by Austrian physicist Lise Meitner, who was Jewish and had been forced to flee Germany to Sweden due to Nazi persecution. This brain drain, Hitler's tyranny, driving out many of Germany's smartest Jewish and dissenting scientists, including Nobel laureates like Hans Bethe and Enrico Fermi, proved catastrophic for the German effort, and conversely, a massive boon for the Allies. The scientists who had fled and understood the destructive potential of fission knew exactly what the Nazis were capable of building. This fear prompted a few key figures to act. In the summer of 1939, just before the war started, Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard, who was deeply concerned about Germany developing an atomic bomb, sought out his former colleague, Albert Einstein, also a Jewish fugitive and physicist who settled in the US in the 1930s. Though Einstein, a lifelong pacifist, didn't participate in the bomb's technical development, his role was critical. He signed a letter, drafted by Szilard, addressed to President Roosevelt. This Einstein-Szilard letter warned the president of the immense power of a uranium bomb and urged the US government to fund research into nuclear chain reactions. Einstein's unparalleled global authority gave the letter the necessary weight, directly leading to the initial funds that would eventually launch the massive Manhattan Project, one of the most secretive and ambitious scientific undertakings in history. Launched in 1942, under the direction of General Leslie Groves and physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, the project brought together some of the world's greatest scientific minds, including Fermi, Niels Bohr, and Richard Feynman, across multiple sites in the United States. Its goal? To harness nuclear fission, to create a weapon of unprecedented power before Nazi Germany could do the same. The scale was staggering. Entire towns were built in secrecy at places like Los Alamos, New Mexico, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington. Over 130,000 people worked on the project, most unaware of its true purpose. Scientists raced against time, conducting experiments on uranium and plutonium, developing complex bomb designs, and solving engineering challenges never before attempted. On July 16, 1945, their efforts culminated in the first successful test of an atomic bomb, a prototype called the Gadget, at the Trinity site in the New Mexico desert. The explosion lit up the pre-dawn sky with a blinding flash and a mushroom cloud rising over 40,000 feet, and a shock wave felt miles away. Oppenheimer famously recalled a line from the Hindu scripture Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Truman learned of the test at the Allied conference that took place from July 17th to August 2nd in Potsdam, Germany. This one featured new leadership. Joining Stalin was Truman in place of FDR, and Churchill was replaced by his successor, Clement Attlee, halfway through the conference. This event solidified the administration of occupied Germany, detailing the economic policy, the 4 Ds: demilitarization, denazification, democratization, and decentralization. It also established the 4-zone division of Germany and established that each power, including France, would take reparations from its own zone, effectively cementing the division of the country. The Allies also issued the Potsdam Declaration demanding Japan's unconditional surrender under threat of utter destruction. Ultimately, the meeting served less as a collaborative planning session and more as a stage for the open ideological friction between the Soviet Union and the Western powers, marking the clear beginning of the Cold War. On August 6th, right after the conference, and just a few weeks after the test in New Mexico, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, on Hiroshima, leveling the city in less than 1 second, instantly killing 80,000 people, with tens of thousands more dying later from radiation and injuries. And 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki by another B-29 called Bockscar, causing further devastation and loss of at least 40,000 more Japanese lives. The unprecedented destruction and shock of these bombings led Emperor Hirohito to announce Japan's surrender on August 15th, now known as VJ Day, Victory over Japan. The formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, officially ending World War II. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the legacy of the war, atomic weapons, displaced populations, and the moral reckoning with genocide would shape the decades to come. The surrender of Nazi Germany in May immediately triggered a humanitarian disaster of unprecedented scale across Europe. With combat over, the priority shifted to dealing with an estimated 11 million displaced persons, a mosaic of released slave laborers, former prisoners of war, and most poignantly, hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. Allied forces, quickly transitioning from fighting to governing, improvised massive refugee camps across Germany, Austria, and Italy, often using former military barracks or even concentration camps. While Allied efforts through the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration successfully repatriated the majority who wished to return home. A persistent core of over 1 million displaced persons, including those who refused to go back to Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe, remained. By the end of 1945, this refugee problem was no longer a temporary logistical challenge, but a profound and long-term political crisis concerning statelessness, resettlement, and the moral obligation to the victims of war. The end of Japanese occupation also led to dramatic changes in Asia. Korea was divided along the 38th parallel, with Soviet forces in the north and American forces in the south, a division that would eventually lead to the Korean War, and Vietnam declared independence from France under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, setting the stage for decades of conflict. Indonesia also proclaimed independence from Dutch colonial rule, sparking a struggle that would last until 1949. This year also marked the definitive ideological pivot that set the stage for the Red Scare. The moment the common enemy, Nazi Germany, was defeated, the wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union fractured, and the Cold War began. In Hollywood, where many writers and directors had been sympathetic to leftist causes during the Great Depression, anti-communist sentiment began to boil over. Groups like the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, formed by conservative industry figures, became vocal about suspected communist infiltration, creating an atmosphere of suspicion. By the close of 1945, the pressure was mounting for the government to investigate the un-American activities in the film industry, transforming Hollywood from a symbol of American power into a domestic target in the burgeoning ideological conflict. Yet, pop culture reflected both relief and reflection. The Lost Weekend won Best Picture at the Academy Awards, tackling the issue of alcoholism. Spellbound, starring Ingrid Bergman and Gregory Peck, brought psychological drama to the big screen, and Frank Sinatra transitioned from band singer to solo superstar and cemented his status as America's voice. Returning from wartime service, he dominated the charts with hits like Nancy, with the Laughing Face, and Dream When You're Feeling Blue. His smooth vocals and romantic ballads made him a cultural icon, adored by fans, especially the Bobby Soxers who packed his concerts. The world also began to heal through sports, resuming Major League Baseball, with the Detroit Tigers winning the World Series. Many NFL athletes returned from military service to reclaim their places on the field, and soccer leagues restarted in Europe, offering a sense of normalcy amid the ruins. Fashion shifted from wartime utility to post-war optimism. Women's styles became more feminine, with fuller skirts and softer fabrics. Men's suits returned to classic tailoring, and the zoot suit faded as rationing ended. And Paris fashion houses reopened, signaling a return to glamour. Finally, in the realm of the mysterious, 45 saw the first reports of Foo Fighters, unexplained aerial phenomena spotted by Allied pilots during the war, fueling speculation about secret weapons and extraterrestrial visitors. These sightings would later feed into the UFO craze of the late 1940s. So that's it for Old News. Year 1945, a year of endings, beginnings, and the birth of a new world order. As Churchill once paraphrased around this time, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.